You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
Welcome to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. I'm your co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Today's going to be a little bit different than our normal segments as we are sharing a panel discussion that occurred as part of the UAlbany School of Social Welfare's Continuing Education series. The workshop was titled The American Disabilities Act 30th Anniversary Panel, and it included Julia Duff, who is an LMSW, Shameka Andrews, a disability advocate, Cliff Perez, an MSW, and James McDonald, who has his MBA. Hopefully you'll be able to get some great content from this workshop, and I want to thank our presenters again for coming on this panel and sharing their knowledge and expertise in the area of the ADA. Hope you enjoy.
Julia Duff, and thank you so much for being here today with us to talk about the American with Disabilities Act that was passed 30 years ago. I started working for the Spina Bifida Association of Northeastern New York when I was in my second year of my MSW program at SUNY Albany. And I started working here because I interned for Cliff Perez during my first year internship through SUNY Albany. So that's where I got into disability advocacy and services. And when I was interning there, we started doing disability awareness panels, and Cliff, myself, and a few other folks from the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley would visit local colleges and raise awareness about different disabilities and access. And we did a few at SUNY Albany, so it's very full circle for us to come back and now highlight the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or as you will hear us call it, the ADA. So each of our panelists today are going to present on different perspectives, but provide a really comprehensive overview about life before the ADA, its passage, and then how far we've come and really how far we still have to go for people with disabilities to have equal access and equal rights in society. So again, thank you for being here, and I will pass it off to our first panelist, Cliff Perez.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first and foremost, let me thank Julia Duff for inviting me to participate in this panel and at this momentous occasion to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and to publicly acknowledge what a fabulous job that she has been doing as executive director of Spina Bifida also. Anyway, just to give a perspective of how long I've been doing this and what I've experienced. I was born in 1954, October 21st, so my birthday is coming up this Wednesday. I grew up at a time when there was no rights for people with disabilities. The first time any rights came around for people with disabilities was in the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And what makes the Rehabilitation Act so momentous is that prior to 1973, it was always referred to as the Vocational Rehabilitation Act because its real and only function was to address vocational issues for people with disabilities. In 1973, something changed. They added a fifth title, Title V, which is where the famous, for us famous, Section 504 comes from. Famous because 504 is the foundation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is the foundation of all aspects of access for people with disabilities. It was one paragraph, basically, but it talked about the fact that no entities that receive federal funding shall discriminate against people with against people on the basis of their disability, or something to that effect. And that's the first time that people with disabilities get recognized. So as I said, I grew up at a time when there was none of that. It was a time of what we call the medicalization model existed, basically meaning that the medical model is what prevailed. That meant that if you couldn't fix people with disabilities, then there was something wrong with them. And for the most part, they needed to be sort of put away so they couldn't be seen by society. So you had this paternalism attitude and you had institutionalization. And so because of that, and the fact that I am legally blind, I was born legally blind. I went to schools in institutions rather than in regular schools. So as I said, in 1973, you get the Rehabilitation Act passed. You start seeing that society is addressing rights of people with disabilities for the first time, at the very least for entities receiving federal funding. We get a real momentum in the 70s, which is very important for the passage of the ADA. We get a real momentum in the 70s and the 80s of different disability laws being passed. This provides a momentum, I think, as a result also of what happened in the 60s for Black Americans and other minorities, primarily meaning women, which are not minorities, as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65. So all of this is a momentum moving forward towards addressing civil rights, which is sort of an irony in a civilized society, because civil rights basically are laws that tell people how to basically treat other people with dignity, right? But in any event, we still had nothing for people with disabilities from the point of view of all aspects of civil rights, because the Rehab Act only addressed entities receiving federal funding. So this momentum continued until 1987, 1988, when there was legislation passed by Congress called the Civil Rights Restorations Act. And this was a piece of legislation that basically told the Supreme Court, as a result of a case that occurred a few years prior, that said that money, any entity receiving money from the federal government, in order for them to implement Section 504, meant that only that entity had to receive that money. So in other words, if another entity within the organization or the entire entity, like a college, didn't specifically get the money, they didn't have to be accessible to people with disabilities. This is in the 1980s, okay? So it took Congress to pass this legislation to basically tell the Supreme Court, no, you're wrong, that is not what we meant. We meant that if the entity received any money from the federal government, all aspects of their programs and goods and services must be accessible. This momentum led to language being brought to Congress to address civil rights of people with disabilities as a whole. It was first drafted in a booklet in 1987 called Toward Independence. This booklet was provided to Congress. This led the foundation then for writing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you get one version in 1989 that addressed many of the issues that we know in the 1990s version, with a big exception, which is in Title IV, because the ADA has 5 titles. And Title IV has all this aspect for telecommunications and communications with people who are deaf. But in the 1989 version, there was a whole section there for people who are blind, so that information would be provided in an accessible format for people who are blind and visually impaired. But because there was no way to pay for this, unlike telecommunications being paid for by everybody, everybody gets charged a little bit more with their phone bills to pay for this service. There was no such thing for blind services, so that was taken out of the 1989 version, so that the 1990 version, there's really not much for people who are blind, other than the overall general aspect of access. And as I said, one of the important things about the ADA that led towards passage was just momentum, but it was also the fact that people with disabilities, regardless of their disability, united behind one issue. And that one issue was this civil rights law that we now know as the Americans with Disabilities Act. They all united together, regardless of their disability, all for this one purpose. So this combination of events is what led to the passage. I played a role in the sense that we provided testimony to Congress at the behest of the father of the ADA, Mr. Justin Dart Jr. We have the father of the ADA, which is Mr. Justin Dart Jr., and the ADA has 2 mothers, Pat Wright, who worked for the Disability Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, and Elizabeth Savage, and I forget what organization she was. But they're the mothers of the ADA. And so they went around the country collecting testimony to show Congress that, yes, people with disabilities were experiencing tremendous discrimination and lack of access into all the goods and services that society provided for everyone else. And we participated in this. We collected, we held public forums here in Albany. The Desmond Americana recorded it, had a few hundred people come and provide testimony, and we provided that to Congress, which is how I got an invitation along with thousands of other people with disabilities to attend the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act on July 26th of 1990. So that's just to give you an idea of what things were like prior to the ADA and what led to the ADA. And I'll pass this on to Julia at this point for her to take it from here. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. And thank you for, I know how much you could have shared on this topic, and you could really do a whole panel yourself. So thank you, that was really informative. And next up, we have Shameka Andrews.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shameka Andrews. I am a disability advocate and consultant. So I was born in 1978. Prior to the ADA, my life, the majority of my childhood was spent in inaccessible apartments where I had to be carried up and down stairs because there was no accessibility in my neighborhood, in my home. I didn't have a wheelchair at this time. So I got around my apartment through crawling up until the age of about 12. So we had no curb cuts in the neighborhood. Plus, because the schools in our neighborhood were not accessible, I had to go to school an hour away from my house. So I didn't get to play with the kids in my neighborhood. I didn't get to go to school in my neighborhood. All of the things and all of the services that I needed were hours away from my neighborhood. So this was caused a lot of problems, and I dealt with a lot of depression and things during this time because I was very isolated because there was no accessibility during this time. We didn't, and even with the passing of the ADA, I remember we moved into our first accessible apartment. They had put all of this consideration into the inside of the apartment, but the city didn't think about the outside of the apartment, and they built this beautiful new building and home that we had, but there was no curb cuts. There was no way for me to actually go anywhere from the front of my house. So I remember it took us about 3 years to get the city to actually put curb cuts into in our neighborhood. So that was my first experiences with advocating for accessibility, and there's still lots of neighborhoods that are like that still to this day, where they don't have curb cuts, or there's issues with streets and the condition of streets. And I know, at the end, when we all worked at the Independent Living Center, we did a lot of work on that and things like that. Also, like I said, as far as, classrooms and being integrated in a classroom, I spent the majority of my time up until high school in one classroom with a variety of people that had various disabilities, most more severe than I had. But they put us all in this one classroom where they put, people with disabilities, and you got your therapies and you got your, whatever right there in the one classroom. I didn't start, going into mainstreaming classrooms until, my last year of middle school. So that was a different experience as well, being integrated and for the first time, and other children and other students not really understanding, who I was or why I was there, or, because they didn't have experience going to school, with other children that had disabilities. So that was difficult at times, because there were a lot of questions about who I was. And at that point, I was spending a little bit more time outside and in the neighborhoods and stuff. And I remember often, because my siblings, I have 3 siblings, all grew up in our neighborhood, and went to school in our neighborhood. And I remember there were times where I actually sat outside with my siblings, and their friends would come along and they'd be like, "Who is that?" And they'd say, "This is my sister." And she's like, "I've never seen her before." And so that was like the big reaction, because up until that point, like I said, I spent the majority of time in the house. So nobody saw me in the neighborhood, and the only time I left the neighborhood was to go to school. So school was really my outlet, because I was so isolated during that period of time. So it really, the passing of the ADA and making things starting to come a little bit more accessible in my life really gave me a lot of opportunities to be more active and to be, to explore more, to travel, to do the things that I am able to do, now, and be as active. And once I did go to graduate high school, I got my first power chair for the first time. That was when really I was able to, get accommodations in the classrooms, and really, like in college, they were able to move my classes because the main buildings were not accessible still at that time. So they were able to move my classrooms. I had that accommodation as well once the ADA was passed. So those things became a little bit more accessible to me as I, graduated high school and college. But unfortunately, even though I was able to go to college and was able to go and participate, I wasn't able to participate in my college graduation because the place where they had it was also not accessible. So even though I went through, my years of college like everyone else, I had to sit in the audience to receive my diploma, and was not able to go across the stage like everyone else. Luckily, this was my first stint at professional advocacy, and after that year, the school moved the graduation, so they are now in a fully accessible building, which I'm very proud of, and like to say that I had, something to do with that. So that was kind of my, experience with getting into advocacy, personal and professional. So, and like I said, there's still lots of work that needs to be done with the ADA, and there's lots of misconceptions out there as far as the ADA are concerned. I know one of the things that people like to bring up to me is, the thing of like automatic doors, for instance. And these are one of the things that people don't realize is not actually covered by the ADA. And I know that Jim, the next speaker, is going to talk a little bit more about things that people may think are a part of the ADA, what we'll call, myths. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So.
Awesome. Shamika, I think you touched on like a few really important points. And, for one, when you talked about life before the ADA and then after, every sentence started with, I was able. Nothing about you changed, but your environment changed, and it opened all these doors for you to access things that we, all take for granted, or, just should have access to. And, having a graduation ceremony where everyone could attend except one person versus choosing an accessible venue where everyone could attend. It's that mindset, and, going back to what Cliff touched on, the medical model of disability, and getting the conversation and language to change around that. Another thought I had when you were speaking too is it's almost, when we talk about even curb cuts, I remember when I was an intern at the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley, and I didn't know what a curb cut was. I didn't know it had any significance in society for people with disabilities. I thought, oh, this is like a nice way to just get off the road. And as someone who doesn't live with a disability, I think that's what people think of. I'm wondering if you guys can actually sort of explain the significance of some of those accessible features we see in society. Even, like when you're at a stop, you're going to cross the street and you hear the noise go off, what the curb cut does and how that helps you. If we could touch a little bit on that and then transition into our next speaker, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, well, before I go on that, I saw that Cliff unmuted himself, so I didn't know if he wanted to add before I
you go for that.
Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, you mentioned curb cuts and people not really understanding, the significance of that. And one story I like to always tell is when there's snow. And a lot of times you might, as you're going along your neighborhood, you might see people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs specifically, in the middle of the street. And a lot of times this will anger people in cars because they don't quite understand why this is happening. Why aren't you on the sidewalk? Why aren't you on, why are you in the middle of the street? So the thing about this is because, especially when there's snow on the ground, a lot of cities, do not clear snow as they should, or there may be some businesses that will clear snow and some that don't. So if you're driving along a street or in a neighborhood, like I often do and other people, you will choose to go in the street because most of the time the street itself is clear because that's what they focus on when they are clearing, the snow. They're making sure it's not in the street. And so it's basically, this is for, even though you see it as a danger, it's actually, people consider it safer to be in the street than to be on the sidewalk. And that's why you'll see most, or like a lot of things, another thing that's happening here in this neighborhood where I live is they're actually working on the sidewalks, putting in new sidewalks. So they're ripping up sidewalks. So again, you have no choice but to, if I'm going about my day and I don't know that that's happening ahead of time, I have no choice but to go in the street. So I think that's one thing that I just wanted to mention, because a lot of that comes up very often is, cars honk at you and they don't understand, they say, get on the street, get on the sidewalk, when they don't completely understand why you're doing that. So.
And just to add to that, I actually always myself walk in the street during the winter time because the streets are taken care of, right? And they're clean and they're clear, and it's just much easier to walk than walking on a sidewalk, hitting maybe a patch of ice that maybe I didn't see, and I think you know the rest. So yeah, it's actually safer to be on the street, My thing is, you cars need to watch out for me. I'm a pedestrian. I got the right of way. That's the way I see it. So, but the other thing I wanted to point out is, if you remember, I said that I went to school in institutions for really all of my schooling, except when I went to college, unless, you want to call college an institution, which it is, but that's another whole thing. Anyway, you recall that Shamika said how when she went to school, even though it was quote unquote integrated, wasn't integrated because she was in one class with other people with disabilities. So we go from putting people with disabilities all in one institution to moving them and having this illusion that somehow we're being integrated, and then putting them all in one room because God forbid they should be seen with non-disabled students, because believe me, that had been the attitude in our society for most of the previous century. And Shamika is an example of this progression towards the end of it, that you would put some people with disabilities all in one classroom and keep them away from everybody else. So that's the other thing I wanted to point out.
Yeah, and also to that, if I can just add, like you said, this idea that people still believe, and there's attitudes that that's what we should do, that we should all be in one classroom and we should be all together and we should be, like I often, like on the bus, and so I'll say, there's issues on the bus, like if some people see me getting on the bus, one thing they'll say is, well, aren't there special buses for you people? And it's like, what? Or they'll get upset that you're on the bus in general, and they say, well, I have places to go, as if I don't have anywhere to go, and I just decided to get on the bus to piss you off today because I had nothing else better to do. That's why I did it. So I could go on about that, but I won't do that. But like you said, it's those attitudes, and I think that's also an important part of, the progression of these things is the attitudes of the people in society. Because if people don't think you deserve to work or go to school or do any of these things, that affects the process of moving forward.
I think the attitude is so important. And unfortunately, I see in so many situations where people do have to pull on the legislation to be heard and just say, well, this is, in the ADA, to make people believe that people deserve access and, to do things that everyone does and have the same experience as everyone does. So those stories, like you said, you could go on because they don't end. And that's probably the biggest stigma that the spina bifida community and the disability community in general face, is just raising that awareness. And advocacy and education are two of the biggest ways to get there. And I'm glad you guys touched on the education piece as well and your experience in schools. I was hoping you would go back to that, Cliff, because it made me think about your experience. The other thing I just wanted to touch on quick too was, I know one of my first projects as an intern at the Independent Living Center was to figure out if Troy had an ADA guide and a plan for addressing inaccessibility in the city of Troy and working with an ADA coordinator. Cliff, I don't know if you have, any insight on that, or what, that project, when you assigned it to me, how these cities should be handling inaccessibility and who that point of contact should be.
Well, all cities, after a certain size of about 50,000 citizens, should have at least begin the process, which is what we call an ADA evaluation plan, to start, evaluating their city for accessibility. And then they should look into hiring somebody or shifting somebody's position. I mean, they really should hire somebody, but most cities have just been shifting responsibility to another person as their ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. So that would be the person if there was an issue of lack of access within the city of some kind, whether it's physical access, whether it's access, like let's say to their public information or public events, even council meetings should be accessible to the public. That includes people with disabilities. They would take that issue up with the ADA coordinator. And when Julia began this process at our center, we actually finished that whole thing after Julia started it, so that the City of Troy does have an ADA plan and it does have an ADA coordinator. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I even think about government hearings and not having a sign language interpreter. This legislation has been around 30 years now. That's why we're here to celebrate it. But there really is still a long way to go. And on that note, I will pass it along to our third panelist, Jim McDonald.
Hi, everybody. Boy, after the first two presentations, it was absolutely fantastic. Cliff, thank you so much for giving us a whole story about different legislation and the other information that's extremely valuable. And Shamika, thank you so much for sharing that information, your own personal stories, and you've done a fantastic job in overcoming all these things. I had, when Julia had asked me to speak a little bit about this, she was asking me about the kind of my life before ADA and my life after ADA. And again, I was also similar to Shamika. I was born with spina bifida. I'm, of course, a lot older. And the degrees in which people can be impacted by spina bifida can vary dramatically. Obviously, my situation was nowhere close to the challenges that Shamika had to overcome. But one thing that is kind of interesting about that, and I think maybe it goes on to a kind of a broader issue, and that is aging with disabilities. When I was a kid growing up, I played sports. I kind of didn't really know, I know I had some issues with like braces periodically, but I kind of didn't even know that I really had a limp until the invention of the video camera, I guess. And all of a sudden I was seeing pictures being taken, videos being taken. I said, wow, I have a pretty pronounced limp. I hadn't really realized that. And then as I got older, things became more and more challenging. All of a sudden, I guess I was walking around Manhattan quite a bit, and somebody stopped me, and they said about whether I needed some help. I never realized that was the case either. So you kind of put these things out of your mind. And then I had to use a cane. And then cane wasn't working anymore, so now I'm actually using crutches at this point. And I have a wheelchair in the car because apparently, and occasionally I'll have to use the wheelchair, and I have to use the wheelchair on occasions. There's a few things that I became aware of when I went into using, again, the crutches and using the wheelchair, was the challenges of doors. Somebody had brought that up. And people don't really think about, the doors and challenges of getting out of doors, and the idea of putting an electronic door opener and how handy that door opener can be. And I teach in two different colleges. I used to teach at a third college, which had gone out of business. They made accommodation for me, allowing me to park in an area where nobody else could park. Again, it's the idea of reasonable accommodation. What could they do? It was an old stone building. They couldn't really put any elevators in or do a lot with it, but they could do what would be a reasonable accommodation, as the word is used. That it's okay, you don't have to park in the handicap spot. You can actually park right next to the door. We'll even let you do that. And that was an accommodation. I had another college where they didn't have an automatic door opener initially, and I was in the wheelchair and I was kind of struggling to get through. And all of a sudden, the next time I came there, they put up an automatic door opener. They didn't even think about it. Basically, it was kind of like I had mentioned it to them, and bang, there it was. So that was one of the colleges that I used. I want to mention that one being Maria College. So I may be familiar with that. And they did that one just automatically on their own, which is great. But I think what's happening, and I think the challenges that I think I'm hitting, maybe some things with with people that have disabilities, and maybe the ADA is, as we've gotten older, is that the challenges have gotten older. And I think that with the population getting older, we're really dealing with, I think, larger and larger numbers of people that particularly have these challenges. And some of this is like some of the the grandfather issues that were put into place, and buildings felt, well, they were old enough and they didn't have to make these changes because the changes would be too expensive. It goes back to this concept or the term reasonable accommodation. What does that mean? And to make changes at businesses to widen bathrooms and put bars in, widen doors, these types of things. What is considered a reasonable accommodation, and things that apartment buildings too. The terms sometimes that they would use, like accessible, handicap accessible. Not even mentioning where I live, but one of the the complaints that I have on that is that the ramps, and sometimes dealing with the upgrade of ramps. They say, okay, there's a ramp, you can use you can get a wheelchair up the ramp. Well, I'm a pretty strong individual, and it's a struggle to get. If you don't have an electric wheelchair, it's a struggle to manually get up that ramp, and people really think about it. And you also look at aging populations and the need. I know sometimes there's the criticism sometimes that people abuse handicap parking and handicap stickers, but with the regulations not really spelling out how many handicap. They spell out how many. They spell out how many handicap spots you need per overall parking spots, but it's really pretty small number. And so 104 spots out of 100, and maybe there has to be relooked at. So I guess the area where I think we're kind of going on this is the fact that you do have people that have they've had and struggled through disabilities. Again, in the case for me, what was it like before the ADA was passed? I really didn't notice much before. But as I've gotten older, it's become harder and harder, and we really need a lot of these accommodations. And I think that they passed the act in 1990, but I think they have to realize that with the aging population and the fact that this is going to become more and more of an issue going forward, be on the lookout for the aging population. And so I don't know if anybody has any comment on that one, but I guess that's what I'm really focusing on, realizing that these doors are an issue, ramps are an issue, parking spaces are an issue. Some of these other things that we basically deal with.
Jim, and great point. Because what he touched on too is that I think everyone's definition of accessibility can be different. And once you live with that disability and you experience it, you learn, okay, it might look accessible on paper, or, to you, the apartment building owner who had it assessed and they said, yep, it's accessible. Really having an understanding for yourself and being able to say, this is what's taking place. It says it's accessible, but because that but usually comes into the conversation whenever you talk about accessibility, or a site visit is almost always necessary for any event, any program, any experience you want to have if you're living with a disability. You do have to do that visit and just assess for yourself, because you can't always trust the person on the other side of the phone. Another piece of what Jim said that really stuck out to me was aging with a disability. And I think when we talk about accessibility, we forget that there's so many different populations who benefit from accessibility. And that's something, I've learned that, I can get up a ramp the same way that someone using a wheelchair can get up a ramp, yet we continue to insist on stairs. And that, that goes for my grandpa. If I was running errands with him, he needed a ramp. So at some point in our lives, we could all experience an injury or just the physical effects of aging, pregnancy, anything that could affect our mobility and require or benefit from some accommodations for accessibility. So it's not a special treatment. It's something that it works for you and it works for me. It's the most inclusive approach, yet we continue to make it a special side, something that, oh, we'll do this for you, when really if we did it accessibly, everyone would be included. I don't know if Cliff or Shamika want to touch on that.
I definitely, I think the one thing that I wanted to touch on was this thing of, like you were saying, a lot of places, you go places like, well, we're ADA compliant, and what I always like to say is accessible doesn't necessarily equate to usable. Yes, maybe you're accessible under the law, whatever the law says, whatever. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be usable for me or for Cliff or for anybody that is going into your particular business, facility, institution, whatever the case may be. So I think that presents a lot of an issue too, because people will often say, and like you said, even that, I always like when I call up certain places, and I say, are you accessible? And they say things like, well, sort of. And it's like, what does that mean? There is no sort of, there is no kind of, there's not a little bit. It's either yes or no. And they say things, well, we only have one step. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm in a power chair. So whether you have a half a step, a 1 step, 2 step, doesn't matter. You're not accessible. So it's just funny sometimes. Like you said, you actually have to physically go there to the space because, I've had lots of conversations with people about accessibility prior to going places. And you get there and it's like, you honestly have no clue what you're talking about because, but anyways, that presents its own challenges because as a person that doesn't drive, it's not like I can just, hop, skip, and a jump to just go someplace and do a site visit every time I'm going somewhere new. But that's what I have to end up doing a lot of the time.
And that's just physical access. And access really is much more holistic than physical, obviously. Access also, it has to do with whether the information is accessible to people who are blind or whether people who are deaf or have some other disability. So think of the problems we're having just with physical access, which is objective and empirical, if you will. So, and then imagine from there for all those other disabilities that are not quite so quote unquote visible, how difficult it is. It's only been until fairly recently that I've been able to access medical information because the medical industry, God forbid, should provide their information to people who are blind in an accessible manner so we could actually read the information we need to read and know about our health. Only recently that has become accessible because out of their great wisdom, they decided, hey, we can put some of this stuff in digital form. Now you can access it on your phone, which is what I've suggested to them for quite some time. But in any event, so it's that kind of progress that we're making, but it's still little by little. And even in terms of that ramp thing that Jim mentioned, perhaps they weren't complying with the law because the ADA is actually very specific about ramps. Ramps have to be what they call 1 in 12, which means for every height of 1 inch, you have to have about 1 foot of ramp. So if you have 1 foot, you have to have your ramp needs to be just as long. And it has to have, depending on how long it gets, it has to have certain sections where it tapers off and it's even, so you could rest. So they probably weren't doing their ramps right. As Shamika mentioned, there's accessibility, and then there's accessibility. So that I just wanted to make sure I understood also the whole holistic aspect of accessibility, which what the ADA tries to do. And always keep in mind that the ADA is a framework. It is a plateau. This is where don't go any lower than this. God forbid we should take it upon ourselves and go beyond that without being told. But the idea of the ADA is, look, let's just stop here. If you can do better, great. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's like you said, it's like the bare minimum. And it's always nice, like Jim, mentioned the school, that put in the doors and whatever, and that will go above and beyond just, okay, this is what the law says, this is what the book says. And other thing that I wanted to mention as far as accessibility, because Cliff mentioned, there isn't one disability, And if you're accessible for me, doesn't mean you're accessible for Cliff. And Jim mentioned, we both have the same disability. And, when we were, the example I like to think about is when we all were working at the Independent Living Center, there were 5 of us, I think, that all had spina bifida, okay? But each one of us had different aspects and were affected in different ways. So accessibility for each one of us would look different. Some of us, like Jim, says he uses a cane. I use a power chair. We have other people with spina bifida that don't use any kind of device at all. So even though we all have spina bifida, it affects us all differently. So accessibility for one of us doesn't necessarily fit accessibility for all of us. And I think a lot of times when people are looking at things around people with disabilities, they want to find this one way and put it all in a box and label it all, and that's just not the way life is. You can't just say, oh, okay, well, we had people in wheelchairs here today, so this is what they said they need. So, that's what everybody needs. That's not the way it works. And I think that's what people are trying to look for is, when it comes to the whole conversation of, which I also hate, is about words. Well, what do I call you people? And it's like, what? Anyways, don't get me, I can't go on and on about things, but.
I was about to say, that's about the only generic rule that there is, that is that no disability is the same regardless of the disability. It's no different among blind people as well, or any other disability. So that's exactly correct.
And I think it's, really full circle to where we started with Shamika's conversation today about curb cuts. And, the ADA did make a difference, because for a while, people's with disabilities voice might not have been heard because they didn't have a seat at the table, because they couldn't get into the building where the table was having the conversation. We still as a society have a habit of making decisions for people without including the people those decisions are impacting. So the ADA has at least opened doors so that it's easier for people with disabilities to have a seat at the table, to advocate and continue to make, huge strides, like every single person here talked about, with increasing access for where they are. And maybe it starts with 2, 1 ramp that's pretty terrible and 2 accessible parking spots, but it opens the door and we're having better conversations about inclusivity and accessibility because of the ADA. And it gave a really big platform. The one last thing I really want to touch on is most people do have access to Netflix. And if I can recommend one thing that will really take this panel and make it incredibly real for you as well, I would watch Crip Camp. Judith Heumann talks a lot about the passage of the ADA, the Capitol crawl, the way people with disabilities were treated, and just the different real life issues that people have, and what passing that legislation took and what it meant. And I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it yet.
By the way, I'm at the end of that. At the very end of Crip Camp, they scan the audience. Remember, I told you I was there. You have to keep in mind is, like anything else in our society, the disability movement has basically been a white movement. All right. So when they scan the audience, there's a number of white people except me. There's one dark spot in the blitz there in the middle, so I'm easy to spot when they scan the audience. That's all I'm saying.
Bonus points for whoever can find Cliff.
Be like, where's Waldo? Where's Cliff?
Yeah. Not hard, just a black spot in the white, easy to spot.
Well,
and nothing negative by that, by the way. It's just reality. That's all at the time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, each of you for sharing your perspective and being a part of this panel with me, the Spina Bifida Association, and all the other associations and, professional places you guys represent today. And I think if we want to open it up for questions, that would be great.
You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.